The tall glass building stood proudly in the middle of the city, its windows shining like mirrors under the morning sun. Inside, the atmosphere was charged with tension. Today was not just another day. It was the day of a meeting that could change everything for the company. At the top floor, the boardroom was already prepared. A long, polished table, leather chairs neatly lined up, bottles of water placed at each seat, and the company's logo glowing on the screen at the front. The billionaire CEO entered the room with his usual air of power. His suit was perfect, his tie straight, his shoes shining. People rose from their seats as he walked in, some bowing their heads slightly, others smiling nervously. They all knew the importance of this day. This was not a meeting with small clients or local partners. This was a negotiation with Japanese investors who had the power to either make the company soar to new heights or send it crashing down. The CEO had built his empire with confidence, charm, and strategy. He was used to commanding a room with his voice, his presence, and his vision. But as he adjusted his watch and sat at the head of the table, there was something in his eyes. Anxiety, hidden but alive. He knew that today's meeting was different. It wasn't about him giving orders. It wasn't about him making speeches. It was about bridging cultures, showing respect, and proving that his company could work globally. And for that, he relied on something he did not have himself, a translator. The Japanese investors arrived on time, their discipline evident in every step. They wore dark suits, carried neat folders, and bowed politely as they entered. Their faces were calm, unreadable, but their presence carried weight. The executives sitting beside the CEO exchanged quick glances, silently reminding each other that one wrong move, one wrong word, could insult their guests and ruin everything. The CEO stood and extended his hand, smiling widely. The investors bowed and a handshake followed. It was a moment of cultural balance where every gesture mattered. The CEO then motioned for everyone to sit. As the chairs moved and papers shuffled, the CEO scanned the room, expecting to see the interpreter he had hired weeks ago for this exact day. But the seat where the interpreter should have been was empty. The CEO frowned slightly, thinking perhaps the person was just late. He adjusted his papers, buying time. He began with his usual introduction in English, his voice smooth, confident. But as soon as he finished, silence filled the room. The investors glanced at each other, waiting. They didn't respond, not because they were rude, but because they hadn't fully understood him. The CEO looked around, waiting for the interpreter to step in. No one did. He coughed lightly, hiding his discomfort. He repeated himself slower this time, but it made little difference. His executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The investors leaned back slightly, their faces polite but blank, as though they were walls the CEO could not reach. The air in the boardroom began to thicken. What had started as a powerful moment was slipping into awkward silence. Every second that passed without communication felt heavier. The CEO could feel sweat prickling at his neck. This was supposed to be smooth, impressive, a show of his company's professionalism. Instead, it was becoming a scene of embarrassment. He leaned toward one of his executives and whispered sharply, "Where is the interpreter?" The executive shook his head quickly.
"Sir, we don't know."
"They haven't arrived." The CEO's chest tightened. His mind raced. He had studied a few Japanese greetings, but that was all. Small phrases meant only as a gesture of respect. He could not carry an entire negotiation in a language he didn't understand. The very thought of trying made him feel powerless, and powerlessness was something he had never allowed himself to feel. The Japanese investors exchanged quiet words among themselves, their tone respectful but firm. The CEO caught none of it, and that made it worse. Were they already doubting him? Were they deciding to walk away? He forced a smile onto his face, but his hands clenched tightly beneath the table. The silence grew longer. Papers lay untouched. The CEO's carefully prepared presentation meant nothing without words to connect it. Every moment that passed chipped away at his image of control. He glanced at the door again, praying to see the interpreter rush in. But no one came. The executives avoided his eyes, some staring at their notes, others pretending to be calm. But their stiff shoulders and nervous glances betrayed them. They all felt the same dread. The company's future was slipping through their fingers, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. For the first time in years, the billionaire CEO felt truly trapped. The weight of his empire pressed against him. The room he usually commanded with ease was now a prison of silence, and though no one knew it yet, salvation was about to come from the most unexpected place. Not from the polished executives in suits, not from the missing interpreter, but from someone the CEO himself had never even noticed. A janitor, quietly standing in the corner with his mop, ready to shock the room with a voice no one expected to hear. The boardroom sat heavy with silence after the billionaire CEO finished his polished introduction. Normally, this was the moment when the interpreter would step in, translating his words smoothly into Japanese, bridging the gap, and setting the tone for the meeting. But nothing came. The air hung awkwardly, still and tense. The CEO cleared his throat, his smile fixed but his eyes restless. He glanced toward the empty chair reserved for the interpreter. It was still vacant. He shifted in his seat, trying not to reveal his irritation, but his executives caught it. They sat frozen, afraid to move, afraid to draw attention to the obvious problem. The Japanese investors exchanged polite looks with each other. Their faces were calm, unreadable, but the silence spoke volumes. A few of them adjusted their glasses. One tapped his pen against the folder in front of him. Their discipline kept them composed, but inside they were surely wondering, where is the interpreter? Why has this company not prepared properly? The CEO forced a chuckle and spoke again, this time slower, adding one of the few Japanese greetings he had memorized. Konnichiwa. Thank you for being here. His pronunciation was stiff, broken. The investors nodded politely, bowing slightly in acknowledgement. But beyond that, the conversation stalled again. The CEO's smile faltered. He turned sharply to one of his aides sitting nearby and whispered through clenched teeth, "Where is the translator?" The aide's face went pale. "Sir, we can't reach them. Their phone is off. We don't know where they are." The words hit like a punch. The CEO's chest tightened. He had spent weeks preparing for this meeting. Financial reports, presentations, proposals. But all of it was useless if he couldn't even communicate. His mind began to race. Was this sabotage? Negligence? Or just bad luck? None of those answers mattered now. What mattered was that the investors were sitting across from him, waiting, watching, and slowly losing patience. The silence stretched further. One of the Japanese executives leaned toward another, whispering a few words in their language. Their voices were soft, respectful, but the CEO caught none of it. He felt powerless, locked out of his own meeting. Every passing second chipped away at his confidence. His polished empire, his reputation for control and foresight, now rested on something as fragile as language. The investor's body language began to shift. Subtle but clear. A raised eyebrow, a glance at the clock, fingers drumming against the table. They were still being polite, but the meaning was there. This is not professional. This is not what we expected. The CEO's mind scrambled. He thought of using translation apps, but the thought of fumbling with his phone in front of billion-dollar investors was humiliating. He considered asking one of his staff if anyone spoke Japanese, but he knew the answer already. They didn't. He tried another phrase, something he had rehearsed the night before. Arigato. We respect partnership. His words sounded broken, stitched together clumsily. The investors gave small nods again, their polite smiles never leaving their faces. But their silence was louder than any rejection. The CEO felt sweat gathering under his collar. He tugged at his tie slightly, forcing his breathing to steady. For the first time in years, he felt stripped of his power. Money, titles, influence, none of it mattered now. In this room, in this moment, he was helpless. The executives beside him shifted nervously. One whispered, "Sir, maybe we should postpone." But the CEO's glare silenced him instantly. Postponing was not an option. Walking away now would mean admitting weakness, maybe even losing the deal forever. The clock ticked louder in his ears. The Japanese investors remained composed, but their patience was thinning. A mistake here could easily be seen as disrespect. The CEO knew that. He also knew he was running out of time. He forced a strained laugh and gestured vaguely toward the presentation on the screen, clicking to the first slide. Charts and numbers appeared, colorful and detailed. He began speaking about them in English, his voice fast and nervous. But the investors' faces stayed blank. The presentation might as well have been in another language because to them it was. The CEO's panic grew. This was his nightmare playing out in real life. All his wealth, his confidence, his empire, reduced to silence by a missing interpreter. And then it happened. A voice spoke from the back of the room, calm, clear, and fluent in Japanese. The words carried naturally across the table, like water flowing where there had only been dryness before. The investor's eyes widened slightly. They turned toward the source of the voice. The CEO's head whipped around, searching, and there in the corner stood the janitor. His mop leaned against the wall, his uniform plain, his face calm. He had been invisible all this time, quietly doing his work. But now he spoke with confidence, bridging the gap no one else could. The room froze. The missing interpreter had not arrived. But perhaps in this janitor something even greater had. The moment the janitor's fluent Japanese cut through the air, the room paused. The investors exchanged quick looks, surprised, their polite masks softening just a little. The CEO blinked in shock, his mind unable to process what he had just heard. A janitor, someone invisible to him until now, had spoken the very words that could save this meeting. But the janitor's voice faded quickly. He had only translated a small part of the CEO's introduction, just enough to make the investors nod politely again. Then he lowered his head, almost as if embarrassed for speaking up, and stepped back toward his mop. The silence returned, heavier than before. The CEO's heart raced. For a brief second he had felt hope. But now with the janitor silent, the panic clawed back. His mouth was dry. His polished presentation lay useless in front of him. He looked around the room at his executives, their faces pale, their eyes begging him to fix this. Yet none of them dared to move. None of them had the skills they needed. The investors began to stir again, whispering among themselves. One leaned toward another, speaking in fast-clipped Japanese. Their expressions shifted, polite but firm, as though they were debating whether to continue at all. One of them checked his watch, the gesture small but loud in its meaning. They didn't have time to waste. The CEO tried again. He gestured at the slides behind him, forcing a smile. "This," he said slowly, "represents our growth." His English rang with authority, but to the investors it was nothing but sound. Their faces stayed unreadable, their bodies stiff. He felt sweat slide down the back of his neck. His empire, his billion-dollar reputation, was slipping through his fingers because of a language barrier. His pride ached. He had always believed he could control any room with his presence, but now his presence felt hollow. He was a man with no bridge, standing on one side of the river while the deal he needed was on the other. The tension bled into the executives seated near him. One nervously shuffled papers, another coughed lightly just to fill the silence. They looked like soldiers on a battlefield without weapons, waiting for an order that never came. The CEO's eyes darted back to the janitor. He was standing quietly at the back, pretending to focus on the mop, but the CEO had noticed the way the investors had nodded when the janitor had spoken. For a flicker of a moment, he considered calling on him. But pride held him back. How could a billionaire CEO, surrounded by high-ranking executives, ask for help from a janitor? The pressure grew. The investors began to look restless. Their politeness was holding, but only barely. A long meeting was planned, but it could collapse within minutes if something didn't change. The CEO's chest tightened with dread. His worst fear was becoming reality. The investors would walk out, and the story would spread. How a powerful CEO had panicked in front of foreign partners because he couldn't even provide a translator. He forced himself to try again, his voice louder, his hands gesturing with more energy, hoping body language might carry what words could not. "Partnership," he said clearly. "Future. Strong future." The words hung awkwardly. The investors gave slight bows, their faces kind but distant. They respected effort, but they needed clarity, not broken phrases. The silence after that attempt was suffocating. The CEO felt trapped in his own boardroom, a prisoner of misunderstanding. Every second was a knife cutting into his pride. The janitor, standing in the corner, looked up again. His eyes flicked to the CEO, then to the investors, then back down at the mop. He shifted his weight, as though debating whether to speak again. He could feel the weight of the room pressing against him, the frustration building, the panic growing. The CEO noticed. For the first time, he saw the janitor not as background, but as a possibility. He opened his mouth slightly, ready to call him forward, but then stopped. The hesitation of pride gripped him. Could he, a billionaire, Place the success of his empire into the hands of someone society ignored? The investors whispered again, their voices sharper this time. One of them leaned forward, closing his folder as if preparing to end the meeting. The CEO's chest burned. He was seconds away from losing everything, and in that moment, the janitor finally raised his head. His voice, calm and respectful, filled the room again. This time louder. This time steady, flowing in perfect Japanese. The investors turned, their stiff posture easing, their eyes softening with relief. They listened intently, nodding as the janitor bridged the silence that had nearly destroyed the meeting. The pressure that had been choking the CEO loosened just slightly. But it came with a sting. His empire wasn't being saved by him or by his executives or by his money. It was being saved by the one man in the room he had never even thought to respect, and that realization hurt more than the silence ever had. The boardroom was on the edge of collapse. The billionaire CEO sat stiff in his chair, his jaw tight, his hands gripping the table as if the polished wood could stop the disaster unraveling in front of him. The Japanese investors had begun shifting in their seats, their faces still polite but now shadowed with impatience. They had bowed, they had waited, but their respect had limits. A deal of this scale needed clarity, and clarity was nowhere in the room. The executives looked like they were sinking ships. Some avoided eye contact with the investors, staring at their notes as if the numbers could save them. Others darted glances toward the CEO, silently pleading for direction. But even the CEO, a man who had commanded governments and global markets, was helpless without the one person who was supposed to stand between languages, the missing interpreter. The silence grew unbearable. The CEO forced himself to speak again, stumbling over a few English words mixed with broken Japanese. His voice cracked with forced confidence. Future. Strong, together. Investment. The words sounded heavy, awkward, stripped of meaning. The investors bowed their heads slightly out of courtesy, but their eyes betrayed them. One of them closed his folder with a soft thud. Another leaned back, sighing silently. It was a language all its own. We are wasting our time. And then it happened. From the back of the room, where a janitor had been quietly standing with a mop and a bucket, a voice rose, calm, smooth, confident. The words flowed in perfect Japanese, carrying the exact meaning of what the CEO had been trying and failing to say. The room froze. Every head turned. The investors' eyes widened slightly, their unreadable masks cracking for the first time that morning. Their ears caught the rhythm, the accuracy, the respect in the tone. It wasn't just Japanese spoken. It was Japanese spoken well. The janitor did not stumble. He did not hesitate. He repeated the CEO's introduction fluently, weaving the phrases together with cultural grace. His voice carried warmth, humility, and clarity, the very things the meeting had been missing. The investors leaned forward now, their expressions softening. One of them even nodded with visible relief. Finally communication, finally understanding. The CEO, stunned, turned in his chair, his eyes locking on the man he had barely noticed before. The janitor's plain uniform, his calloused hands, his simple posture. None of it matched the voice now commanding the respect of billionaires. For a moment, the CEO thought he was imagining it, but the investors' reactions confirmed it. This was real. The janitor bowed politely after finishing his translation, his face calm, his tone humble. "If you permit me," he said in English, his voice steady, "I can continue to assist." Gasps rippled across the executives. A few leaned back in their chairs, stunned that someone they had walked past countless times was now holding the fate of the company in his hands. The CEO's mouth opened slightly, but no words came. His pride battled with his desperation. But before he could respond, the investors spoke up, in Japanese, directing their words toward the janitor, not the CEO. The janitor replied smoothly, his translation seamless, his confidence unshaken. The investors nodded, their body language shifting from guarded to engaged. One of them even smiled, something rare in such high-stakes negotiations. The power in the room had shifted. It no longer belonged to the CEO or the executives in their expensive suits. It belonged to the janitor, the man who had been invisible until this very moment. The CEO's chest tightened. Relief washed over him, but so did shame. He had prided himself on seeing value where others couldn't, on recognizing talent in unlikely places. Yet here was proof that even he, the billionaire, had been blind. He had walked past this man countless times, never asking his name, never considering his worth beyond cleaning floors. And now that very man was saving him from humiliation, from failure, from losing everything in front of the investors. The janitor continued, his voice calm and professional, his respect for both sides evident in every word. He wasn't just translating, he was connecting. He added small gestures of cultural understanding, choosing words that built bridges instead of walls. The investors responded warmly, their stiff posture relaxing, their eyes turning bright with interest again. For the first time since the meeting began, the atmosphere shifted. The tension lifted, replaced by focus and respect. The janitor had turned the tide with nothing but words and humility. The CEO sat back, still silent, still stunned. The man he had overlooked had become the most important person in the room, and deep inside he knew. This meeting would not be remembered for his charts or his title. It would be remembered for the unexpected voice that rose when everything was falling apart. The air in the boardroom felt different now. Only minutes earlier the atmosphere had been stiff, suffocating, and filled with unspoken disappointment. But the moment the janitor's voice filled the room in fluent Japanese, everything began to shift. It was as if a curtain had been pulled back and light had entered. The Japanese investors, who had been on the verge of closing their folders and leaving, now leaned forward with genuine interest. Their polite but distant expressions softened. One of them adjusted his glasses, looking directly at the janitor with respect. Another gave a small nod of approval. For the first time that morning there was engagement instead of silence. The janitor, holding his ground humbly near the back, didn't falter. His translations were smooth, his tone balanced between formal respect and cultural warmth. He didn't just translate the CEO's words, he refined them, reshaping awkward phrases into sentences that carried meaning and dignity. When the CEO stumbled through a slide, the janitor bridged the gaps, making it sound professional in Japanese. The investors responded. Their questions grew longer, deeper. They no longer spoke in broken English or with hesitant words. They spoke freely in their own language, their voices confident. And each time the janitor translated flawlessly, delivering their concerns and ideas to the room. The executives stared in disbelief. Men and women who had spent years chasing promotions, dressing in suits worth thousands, and learning the art of corporate presence now sat powerless, watching a man in plain work clothes command the respect of billionaires. A janitor whom they had walked past every day without acknowledgement now carried the weight of the meeting on his shoulders, and he carried it with ease. The CEO himself was caught in a storm of emotions. Relief because the deal was no longer slipping away. Shame because his empire built on control was being rescued by someone he had never truly seen. Awe because the janitor's skill wasn't just surprising, it was extraordinary. But pride still battled within him. He had always believed that power was his alone, that he was the anchor in every storm. And now, in front of foreign investors and his own staff, it was the janitor who had become the anchor. The investors began addressing the janitor directly. One leaned forward and spoke with sincerity, his tone respectful. The janitor bowed slightly before translating his words. They appreciate the presentation. They want to know more about your long-term vision. The CEO swallowed, forcing a smile, and spoke. His words were shaky at first, but each time the janitor repeated them in Japanese, they sounded strong, polished, impressive. The CEO's confidence began to rebuild, though he knew deep down it wasn't his charisma saving him. It was the janitor's voice. The balance of the room had shifted completely. Where once the CEO's silence had threatened collapse, now the janitor's presence pulled everyone together. The investors' pens began moving across their papers again. Their nods became more frequent. The air was alive with conversation instead of dead silence. One of the executives whispered under his breath, "This is unbelievable." Another replied quietly, "It's like he's been hiding in plain sight." The janitor remained calm throughout it all. He didn't boast, didn't try to draw attention to himself. He stood steady, speaking with dignity, bowing respectfully at the right moments, careful never to overshadow anyone. But at the same time, it was impossible not to notice him. His skill commanded respect without asking for it. The investors exchanged smiles now, and one even chuckled softly at a joke the janitor translated with perfect timing. The tension had broken completely. What had begun as a disaster was turning into a productive meeting, not because of wealth or power, but because of one man's hidden ability. The CEO leaned back slightly in his chair, his eyes fixed on the janitor. In that moment, he realized something he had never admitted before. True leadership isn't about money, titles, or power. It's about recognizing the value in people, especially those everyone else ignores. And though the CEO still held the title of billionaire, in that room on that day, the respect belonged to the janitor. The boardroom was no longer suffocating. The atmosphere, once thick with awkward silence, now pulsed with energy. Questions flowed, answers followed, and the conversation moved as smoothly as if the meeting had been planned this way from the beginning. But the man at the center of it all wasn't the billionaire CEO, it was the janitor. The CEO sat at the head of the table, outwardly calm, but inside his chest a storm brewed. He watched as the janitor translated his words into flawless Japanese, watched the investors' eyes light up with understanding, watched their polite nods transform into genuine respect. Every detail of the meeting, the flow, the connection, the engagement, was being carried not by him, not by his executives, but by a man in a faded uniform with cleaning supplies waiting quietly by the wall. For years, the CEO had believed he was the smartest man in every room. He had built his empire from nothing, climbed over competitors, and stood proudly at the top. He had convinced himself that he alone had the charisma, the vision, the skill to control outcomes. Yet now, as he looked across the table at billion-dollar investors hanging on the janitor's every word, he felt something unfamiliar, small, invisible. The investors spoke directly to the janitor now, their eyes bypassing the CEO entirely. They asked questions, serious ones about long-term partnerships, expansion, and cultural respect. The janitor listened intently, bowing slightly before translating their concerns into clear, respectful English. Each time the CEO answered, but it was the janitor's voice in Japanese that earned nods of approval. It was like watching his power drain away, piece by piece. The CEO's mouth moved, but the respect flowed toward the janitor. The realization stung deeper with every passing minute. One investor even smiled warmly at the janitor and said something in Japanese that made the others chuckle softly. The janitor bowed again, his humility shining through as he translated the light-hearted comment for the CEO. The room relaxed further, but the CEO's stomach twisted. That moment of connection, something he had always believed he could command, had been built not by him, but by someone he had barely acknowledged. He thought back to all the mornings he had walked past the janitor without a glance, all the times he had seen him cleaning floors, wiping tables, invisible in the background. Never once had he wondered about his story, his skills, his life outside of the uniform. To the CEO, he had been nothing but part of the scenery. Now that same man was the reason the company's future wasn't burning to ash in front of foreign investors. The CEO's pride resisted the truth. "This is still my company," he told himself. "These are still my investors." The janitor is only translating, nothing more. But deep down, he knew it was a lie. The investors weren't nodding because of him. They weren't smiling because of his vision. They were engaged because the janitor had made it possible for them to understand, to connect, to trust. The CEO's executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats too. They had never seen him look this powerless. They whispered quietly to each other, their eyes darting between their leader in his expensive suit and the janitor in his plain clothes. The contrast was almost too sharp to ignore. The CEO forced himself to maintain control. He answered questions with confidence, gestured at his slides, spoke with authority. But each time his words felt weaker, as though they depended on the janitor to give them weight. The irony was painful. A billionaire relying on a janitor to keep his empire from crumbling. As the meeting went on, the CEO's shock deepened into something more personal. Shame. Not just because he had overlooked the janitor's skills, but because he realized how shallow his vision of people had been. He had always measured worth by titles, by suits, by wealth. And yet the most valuable man in the room had been the one sweeping floors. His heart sank further when he caught the investors' eyes. They weren't looking at him with disappointment anymore. They were looking at the janitor with respect. And that respect was stronger than anything he had felt directed at himself in years. The CEO leaned back in his chair, his face composed for the room, but inside, he was reeling. This was a kind of defeat he had never known. Not a loss of money, not a failed deal, but a loss of something deeper. The realization that power doesn't always come from wealth, and respect doesn't always belong to the one wearing the suit. The janitor, calm as ever, continued to bridge the gap. His humility never wavered. He didn't boast, didn't gloat, didn't act like he was the hero of the room. He simply did what needed to be done, with grace and dignity, and that, more than anything, shook the CEO to his core. Because in that moment, he realized the truth. The man he had overlooked was showing him what real leadership looked like, and it wasn't him. The meeting that had begun as a disaster was now flowing like a river, smooth and full of life. What had once been silence and embarrassment was now a back-and-forth exchange filled with questions, answers, and ideas. And at the center of it all was not the billionaire CEO, not the sharply dressed executives, but the janitor, calm, steady, and fluent. The Japanese investors leaned forward, their earlier stiffness gone. Their pens moved quickly across their notes. Their voices carried energy as they spoke, sometimes even with small smiles, sometimes with laughter. They were no longer simply tolerating the meeting. They were engaged in it. The janitor's translations weren't robotic. He chose his words carefully, carrying not just meaning but respect, cultural nuance, and warmth. It was as if he had opened a door that had been locked since the first minute. The CEO watched in silence, his heart pounding. He answered when spoken to, but every time the janitor's voice gave his words power. Alone, his phrases had been flat and meaningless. With the janitor, they became polished, persuasive, alive. The CEO couldn't escape the truth. The man who had been sweeping floors was now the bridge that carried his empire across the gap. One investor leaned back in his chair, folding his hands with a thoughtful smile. He spoke in Japanese, his tone lighter than before, as though the tension of earlier had melted away. The janitor bowed slightly and translated, "They say your company shows promise. They believe there is room for partnership." A ripple of relief passed through the executives. Shoulders sagged, breaths were released quietly. The CEO's chest loosened for the first time that morning. The deal wasn't slipping away anymore. It was within reach. The investors began asking deeper questions about long-term goals, about sustainability, about cultural alignment. And each time the janitor translated with flawless care. His voice carried conviction, his delivery built trust. The investors nodded more frequently now, exchanging approving glances. At one point, an investor leaned forward and spoke warmly to the janitor himself. He chuckled at his own words, and the others joined in softly. The janitor translated the line for the CEO. "He says your company is fortunate to have you." The words landed like a stone in the CEO's chest. Fortunate to have him. And the truth was, they weren't talking about him. They were talking about the janitor. Still, the CEO swallowed his pride and pressed on. With the janitor's help, he presented his vision, explained his numbers, and laid out his plans. And this time it was understood. Every chart, every slide, every point he had prepared was finally clear, finally meaningful, because someone had given it life. The climax came when the investors began to murmur among themselves, nodding, their tones full of agreement. Then their leader, the eldest among them, looked at the janitor directly, spoke in slow, deliberate Japanese, and smiled. The janitor bowed and translated, "They agree to proceed. The partnership will move forward." The room erupted, not loudly but in subtle, powerful ways. Executives sighed with relief. Some even smiled for the first time all morning. The CEO leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes briefly, as though the weight of the world had finally lifted off his shoulders. The deal had been saved, but everyone in that room knew the truth. It hadn't been saved by wealth, power, or planning. It had been saved by the one man no one expected, the man with the mop and the uniform. The investors stood to leave, bowing respectfully. They bowed not just to the CEO, but also to the janitor, their eyes holding respect and gratitude. The janitor bowed back humbly, his face calm, his pride hidden beneath layers of humility. As the investors walked out, one of them placed a hand briefly on the janitor's shoulder and said something softly in Japanese. The janitor's eyes softened and he nodded. When the CEO asked later what was said, the janitor replied simply, "He told me respect is not given by title, it is earned by action." The CEO said nothing, He couldn't. The words cut too close to the truth. The meeting was over. The deal was sealed. And the company had been saved. But in the quiet that followed, one question remained heavy in the air. Who truly had earned the most respect that day? The billionaire in his suit or the janitor with his mop? The boardroom slowly emptied, but the echoes of what had just happened stayed in the air. The Japanese investors had left satisfied, their bows deep and respectful, their smiles genuine. They had come in doubtful, almost ready to walk away, and yet they left with confidence in the company's future. The deal was alive, stronger than anyone had expected. The executives stood quietly near the table, still processing what they had witnessed. Some whispered to each other in disbelief. Others just stared at the janitor, who now stood by the wall again, holding his mop as if nothing extraordinary had happened. It was almost surreal, how someone who blended into the background just hours earlier had become the very reason their company had been saved. The CEO remained seated at the head of the table, silent. His eyes were locked on the janitor, but his mind was racing far faster than his gaze. He had sat in countless meetings across the world. He had faced kings, presidents, billionaires, but none of those moments had shaken him the way this one had. For the first time, he had seen power shift away from money, away from titles, away from suits and prestige. It had shifted to something rawer, purer, knowledge, humility, and respect. He rose slowly from his chair, the sound of it scraping against the floor drawing everyone's attention. The room went silent again. The CEO walked across the polished floor toward the janitor. Each step felt heavy, not because of anger, but because of the weight of pride he was about to set down. The janitor lowered his head respectfully, as though bracing himself for criticism. But instead, the CEO stopped in front of him and extended his hand. His voice, usually booming with authority, was softer than anyone had ever heard. "You saved us today," he said simply. The janitor blinked, surprised. He hesitated, then took the CEO's hand firmly but humbly. "I only did what was needed, sir." The CEO shook his head. "No, you did more. You gave this company something money couldn't buy: respect, connection, humanity." His words grew heavier with each sentence. "And I am ashamed it took me this long to see you." Gasps rippled softly among the executives. They had never heard their leader speak this way, never seen him bow even slightly to someone of lower rank. Yet here he was, not only acknowledging the janitor but honoring him in front of everyone. The janitor's eyes softened, though his humility never wavered. "I wasn't trying to be noticed," he replied quietly. "I was only trying to help." The CEO's chest tightened. In those words lay the heart of what he had been blind to all along, that greatness does not need recognition to exist. The janitor's value had always been there. It simply hadn't been seen. The CEO turned toward his staff, his voice rising with conviction now. "Let this be a lesson to all of us. Titles don't define a person. Suits don't define a person. What matters is the ability, the character, and the heart they carry. This man," he gestured to the janitor, "has reminded me of something I forgot. Respect belongs to everyone." The executives bowed their heads slightly, the truth settling into their hearts. Some even felt shame, realizing how often they too had walked past the janitor without acknowledgement. The CEO looked back at the janitor and asked softly, "What is your name?" The janitor smiled faintly, as though the question itself was a reward. "David, sir." "David," the CEO repeated, letting the name hang in the air with weight. "From today, you are not just a janitor in this building. You are a respected part of this company, and I will make sure everyone knows it." David bowed slightly, gratitude in his eyes but humility still holding him steady. "Thank you, sir. But I will keep doing my work no matter what title you give me, because work, whether big or small, deserves the same respect." Those words struck deeper than any contract or deal ever could. The CEO nodded slowly, almost in awe. "Then perhaps you are the richest man in this room, David." "Richer than me." The janitor smiled softly, then quietly returned to his mop. The moment was over, but the lesson was carved into every soul who had witnessed it. As the CEO left the boardroom with his executives trailing behind him, he knew this day would be remembered forever, not as the day a deal was signed, but as the day he was humbled by the man everyone had overlooked, because respect is not measured by wealth or title. It is measured by action, by kindness, by the ability to step forward when the world needs you most. And that day, it wasn't the billionaire who saved the empire. It was the janitor,